Assalamu alaikum. My name is Aisha Hamdulay. I am going to speak about the land debate in South Africa. Um, I have written my honours thesis on urban land justice in South Africa, and essentially looking at what does urban land reform mean in the context of the land issue in South Africa. I've also worked at Indifuna Kwazi, which is an NGO which deals with urban land justice in Cape Town and South Africa. And I've also worked at a women's rights organization where women's issues, women's tenure issues, and land rights have been discussed. So basically, I am going to give you an overview of what land reform means in South Africa and where urban land reform fits into the whole picture. Okay, so essentially, in my honours thesis, I opened my honours thesis with a quote from Frantz Fanon, and that quote goes as follows. So I think that it's really relevant to the land question, and I'll refer back to this again. And so the quote essentially goes as: for colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity, right? So just keep that in the back of your mind throughout this discussion. So just to put things in a little bit of context, I'm going to throw some stats at you. So firstly, South Africa's inequality rate is one of the highest in the world. It's currently at 0.67, which means our country is 67% unequal, right? More than half of our country lives below the poverty line, and basically this ties directly into issues of land, right? The land debate comes from a long historical backdrop. Most recently, this was on many people's lips because there was discussions about changing the constitution to allow for the government to expropriate land without compensation, right? And so all these issues about, is this just, is this fair, all of those things basically were coming up. So essentially, we are seeing, and what we are seeing in terms of the land debate is that we see an agrarian bias in land reform discourse. So what this means is that when we speak about land reform, we tend to mostly speak about redistributing agricultural land, and we don't speak enough about urban land, right? And this is an issue because urban land is in the context of South Africa right now much more relevant than agricultural land. 65% of people live in urban areas in South Africa, right? So what we see is that agricultural land is being approached with the principles of, it's approached with principles and a framework of distributive justice, but urban land is approached through spatial planning discourse, and it's framed as a housing question. It's not framed as a question of justice, whereas agricultural land is framed as a question of justice, right? So just to understand urban land reform a bit more broadly, right? Urban land reform is essentially a concept which aims at addressing collective injustices of the past, covered by a history of conquest, exploitation, and disposition, right? So it's about undoing disposition and injustices from past oppression. Within land reform, there are essentially two types of justice within that, right? So you've got corrective justice and you've got distributive justice, right? So corrective justice essentially refers to when something has been wrongfully taken away from you, that it is rightfully given back to you, right? And distributive justice talks about equal and fair allocation of resources on the grounds of merit and need. It talks about undoing a skewed distribution of wealth of a status quo. Just to bring it basically back home, in terms of Islam, I'm not a scholar. I've delved here and there in the Islamic sciences, but from my limited knowledge, I do know that both of these concepts are most definitely spoken about in the Quran, with distributive justice that links directly to zakah, corrective justice in terms of when you're taking something from someone else, that a wrong must be rightfully corrected in that way, right? So in terms of land reform in South Africa, there are essentially three core tenets to land reform in South Africa, right? So the first tenet is land restitution. So what land restitution is, that in terms of the two justices that we spoke about, land restitution refers to corrective justice. So when you have a historical based claim to a piece of land, that is restitution, that historical claim that land was taken away from you, and you've got a historical claim to that land, that it's given back to you, that it's restituted to you, right? So that's what restitution is. Most often spoken about in cases of District 6, very common restitution cases, still going on, still not completely resolved, but if you want to learn more about restitution, Google District 6 and land restitution, right? The second tenet of land reform is land tenure. So land tenure is talking about when you live on land that you don't own, how can you use it, how are you allowed to occupy it, right? So this is what land tenure refers to. In the context of South Africa, it mostly refers to farm workers who are living on farms that they don't own, but they work there and they are occupying the land. So what rights do they have? What rights do you have when you are living on land that you do not own, but you are using it and you're occupying it? Lastly, for me, which is the most important one and which I expand on the most, is land redistribution, right? So land redistribution talks about distributing land to those who need it but cannot afford it, right? So you don't have a specific historical claim to a specific piece of land, but you are part of a greater system of oppression which has now caused skewed wealth patterns, etc., etc. So land redistribution is about a broad skewing of unequal wealth patterns, etc., etc. So those are your three core tenets of land reform, right? So the South African government, post 1994, had set up a land reform program which aimed to address all of those tenets, right? The goal was essentially to correct skewed patterns of racial land ownership. It was to return historical land to its rightful owners and undo the denial of a right to access land, right? So here's a snapshot of how things looked post 1994. White people made up 10% of the population. They owned 87% of agricultural land and businesses, right? So in terms of the land reform program, the government tried to implement a number of programs which by and large have failed, right? So to mention a few, you've got RDP, I'm just mentioning some acronyms. It's not necessary to go into detail at this point, but there was the LRAD, the SLAG program. There were various redistribution policies where government spoke about redistributing agricultural land, but by and large, maybe they had like a 5 to 10% success rate, right? But still, in terms of speaking about land reform, we see an agrarian bias. So in policies, in legislation, in everywhere where we speak about land reform, we're talking about agricultural land, right? So if you look at like scholarship academic papers on land reform, it's because distributive land redistribution in terms of land is looked at as a question of capital. So it's looked at as a question of capital and a source of livelihood. But it doesn't necessarily mean that agricultural land is the main source of capital. And so like very well-known scholars in South Africa who write on land, Ruth Hall, all of the PLAS publications. So these scholars are saying that when looking at the land question, we have to ask specifically, how has land been accessed, how has land been used, and how has the labor for that land been sourced, right? And this brings us to basically the question of what you call a wage labor economy. And so to explain that a bit further, before South Africa became deeply urbanized, the black population, the non-white population, were largely used as wage laborers in an agricultural economy. However, that changed through the course of apartheid, and so there was large-scale disposition of people from rural areas to people. They then placed them, the apartheid government then placed them on the peripheries of cities so that they could serve as labor for an urban economy, right? So things changed around. So things turned around. And again, looking at where we are now, 65% of South Africa is urbanized. That means that 65% of our population lives in urban areas, right? So why do we not talk about redistributing urban land? South Africa is not actually primarily an agrarian society, right? So I'm going to give you the stats now, right? So according to Stats SA, agriculture only makes up 3 to 5% of the GDP. Only 13% of land in South Africa is arable, and only over 1/3 is located in the Northern Cape, right? So 13% of land is arable, of agricultural land is arable. Over 1/3 of that is located in the Northern Cape, and the Northern Cape, 2% of our population resides, right? So hearing this, it shouldn't make sense, like it doesn't make sense to me why there's this great push for everyone to get agricultural land when 65% of our population is living in urban areas. So yeah, that's the first basically point I want to bring out in terms of why the push in terms of land redistribution for agricultural land is not that sensible, right? So now we have to look at why is urban land not included in this discourse, and the issue is basically that urban land is framed, as I mentioned earlier, agricultural land is framed as a question of justice, but urban land reform is not afforded the same privilege, just put it that way, right? So urban land it's basically framed under the discourse, and it's technically put under spatial planning, and it's misconstrued as a question of housing, right? So we have to ask ourselves then, is South Africa going through a housing crisis? Is South Africa going through a land crisis? Or is South Africa going through a livelihood crisis? It's not either one, it's all three. And they are all three connected, right? So while agricultural land is basically left to the devices of land redistribution, urban land is left to the devices of spatial planning and housing. And this is deeply problematic, right? And it's problematic because urban land reform is about basically skewing patterns of wealth based on past disposition and past oppression, and then the whole aspect of how urban land was obtained and how urban land is being profited from is completely it's completely left out of the discourse on land reform. And so my whole argument in my thesis is that we have to shift the land question into the question of land redistribution, essentially. I'm just checking the comment here. With regards to the urban land reform, the post-94 reform program placed heavy weight on the Lands Claim Commission with the Lands Claim Court. We've seen that the temporary nature of the structures have been a significant contributing factor to the failures of the reform program. Would capacitating these structures not be a good place to start? Okay, so I'll remember this question, Kamil, and then I'll address it. I'll address it a little bit later, because I think it ties in better over there. But I have noted that question. So basically, what we've established now is that urban land reform is framed under the discourse on spatial planning and housing, right? So if we view housing as an asset, right, then spatial planning essentially determines the access that you have to that asset, and the property market determines the value, right? So we need to look at it in the sense that housing is an asset that can accumulate capital. It can impact your economic resources, your standard of living, right? And our constitution provides for a right to housing, right? But since it's not framed in the discourse on land reform, we then have to look at, well, as a question of justice, how does that play out, right? So we know that our constitution says we have a right to housing, but how has the government approached the right to housing, right? So if now we have to look at apartheid spatial planning. So apartheid spatial planning, which we have probably all learned about or heard about at some point, essentially divided people according to race into different areas, and strategically so placed black people, Indian people, colored people on the urban peripheries of cities. And when I say strategically located, I really mean extremely strategically located. So what I wanted to do was to show everyone a map, which I had a link to, but I'm not sure if that's possible. But anyways, I'll share them later on in the comments. But essentially, I think I can do it like this. Just give me one moment. Okay, so if you can see this map over here, so this is a map of the racial distribution in Cape Town after the Group Areas Act, right? So you can see the dark spaces are the areas that were allocated to black people. Black people make up more than 70% of our population, but you can see how small those spaces are, right? Colored people over there, and then Indian is clear, and white people are the gray areas. So white people were allocated land all along the Atlantic seaboard. The coastal areas were allocated land when they made up less than 10% of the population, right? As you can see over there. So I know most people will know a lot of this information already, but it's necessary to put things into context, essentially. But basically, what the Group Areas Act did was more than just racially segregate people. It was about economic segregation as well. It was about eliminating in economic hubs, it was about eliminating non-white competition. Um, it prevented black people from owning property at all costs. I think 1968 was the first time that black people were allowed to own property, but this had limitations. They were only allowed to own property in the homelands. And in 1994 was actually the first time that there were absolutely no property right limits in terms of black ownership of property. So even if someone was by the means, they were not allowed to buy property in an area that was not designated to their color, right? So this is the aspect for me that is not spoken about enough, and that has made a huge impact on our economic on our economic landscape today. So basically, once non-whites were thrown out of the areas and the Group Areas Act was implemented, have you ever questioned whatever happened to those properties? So essentially what happened to those properties is that it was free capital. Basically, it was. So what would happen is that the government, basically the apartheid government, would seize the house, right? Then they would throw it into a pool of properties that were on sale at below market value, right? It was put on sale at below market value, and then only white people were allowed to purchase property anyway. Indian people were allowed to purchase property, but in limited areas, right? But now just imagine this. I'm just checking the comments over here. Okay, so I'll check all these questions, yeah, towards the end. But yeah, basically properties were put into a pool. They were sold at below market value. And so basically white people and white developers were allowed to basically purchase these properties at below market value and then develop them and to either sell them at a higher price or, yeah. So I'm just want to give you this. These are actual statistics of what those property values look like. Just give me a moment to get there. So for example, these are houses in Mowbray, right? So when they were sold, when they were seized by the government, they were sold for 2,050 rand, right? They were sold for 2,050 rand. They were resold 4 years later for 13,200 rand. That's one example. Another example, in 1965, there was a house sold for 8,400. In 1968, the same house was resold for 26,168 rand. Now, just imagine someone purchased a house for 8,400 rand, 2,050, 1,800 rand. They never sold that property. Now today they're going to sell that property and they're going to sell it for what, 3-4 million rand. Like, that's free money, you know? So this is why urban land is such a huge part of land reform, because if we're talking about land reform as a means of capital, it's not about the size of the land, it's about what capital that land brings in. And it's about the capital that the land brings in. And if we are framing housing as a separate issue to that, like that's also problematic, because I mean, housing and land obviously are interlinked, but a house is an asset. A house accumulates capital in the same way that land accumulates capital. And so we have to then look at who has access to urban land, what determines the access to urban land, and is that fair, right? So what determines access to urban land? Because of the economic system that we follow, we use a neoliberal economic system, which essentially is a free market where anybody is allowed to purchase land. But that's obviously, property prices are determined by demand and supply for land, right? And so if you have already established an economy where a certain racial group has already been afforded the privilege to acquire assets that are going to bring in capital, and then implement a market that is not going to grant someone that, where your access is based on your economic status, but you have not done anything to undo the economic status that was put on someone, or you have not done anything to undo the unjust acquirement of that asset, then there's a big issue there, right? So yeah, then we have to, if we're looking at urban land as a question of housing, then we have to look at, okay, so what is the government doing to provide housing to everyone? So we're all familiar with RDP houses, gap housing. Just there's many housing schemes: RDP, gap housing, BNG, social housing, emergency housing, and while, I mean, I know a lot of people who obviously don't understand the context of everything, and sometimes I have conversations with people in my community who don't really understand, but it's, you're saying you're giving someone a house, don't be ungrateful about it. But it's not about being ungrateful. Like, to give someone a house like on an RDP program that is still located like far off down the end too, that is not justice. So we have to then look at where are the government locating housing programs. And if you look at the location of housing programs, the map looks exactly the same as the racial distribution of the Group Areas Act. Let me just draw that map quickly so I can show you guys. Okay, so this map that I'm going to show you is the latest racial distribution map of South Africa, and it looks exactly the same as that Group Areas Act map. These are the black areas. This is the black population, and see how densely populated it is. The blue is the white population, and people have not moved out. There's nothing being done to undo all of this unjust land distributions over here. Again, this is the location of housing. These are the locations of housing programs in Cape Town. And again, we're locating housing on the peripheries of cities. Look at this. Here's mainland Cape Town. Here's our housing program. So is it really justice if you're giving someone a house that's not really taking them out of the situation that they were put into? So those are questions that we must ask. And then I want to show you the Airbnb map. I'm just drawing up another map. Okay. So going back to, again, speaking about land as an asset and housing as an asset. We need to remember like how those houses were acquired, how they were put into those pools and literally sold. Like, houses were taken away from people and literally sold for peanuts. And now this is what's happening. So this is an Airbnb map. Look at this. This is an Airbnb map of Cape Town. So most Airbnbs are located along your Atlantic seaboard and mainland Cape Town. People own these houses. So again, to take that example of of those houses in Mowbray, imagine that someone it could have been one of our family members that lived in Mowbray, and that house was taken away from them. They were put into Mitchell's Plain. That house was sold for 2,050 rand. It was developed, and now it's on Airbnb, and it's making 250,000 rand a month. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about generational wealth, when we talk about white monopoly capital, when we talk about intergenerational wealth. These are the realities, and these are the types of things we're talking about. And while people do pay like normal property tax and all of these things on those properties, is that enough? Those are questions that we have to ask. So another aspect of housing, in the context of Cape Town anyway, is something called zoning. So as we see, housing is still located on the urban peripheries of cities. Basically, the city and the province essentially has control over zoning. Now, what zoning is, it's a spatial planning tool. So it gives power to the city and the province to zone certain areas for specific types of development, right? So if an area is not zoned for housing, then housing can't be built there. If an area is zoned for business, then only business can be built there. And so that's basically a tool of control that can be used to prevent government housing from being located like in well-located areas. So zoning is basically like one of the mechanisms of control over land, and it's really like people have a misconception that there's not enough urban land to distribute or to use like for housing. Like, that's nonsense. There's a lot of land. If anyone follows Reclaim the City, and Ndifuna Kwazi does a lot of work on these types of things. And so, for example, one of the biggest campaigns in the last year has been the Rondebosch Golf Course. It's a huge piece of land, and it's leased for like something like 1,000 rand a year or something. Literally, it's rented out for 1,000 rand a year to the golf management or whatever. But besides for that, there are many like available pieces of land that are available for housing, but that the state or the province do not want to zone for social housing, right? So yeah. So yeah, essentially, to bring everything together, when we're talking about land reform as a question of justice and as a question of distribution and redistribution and skewing and correcting skewed wealth ownership, I don't think that we cannot separate urban land from the land question, and housing is a pivotal aspect of that. And so there needs to be a reconceptualizing of the whole land question in South Africa, so that land and housing is not seen as a separate thing, and that we have to understand what's the objective of land reform. The objective is to undo a skewing of wealth distribution. And going back to those statistics, if it brings in 3 to 5% only of the GDP, if 65% of our population are living in urban areas, and yeah, if 65% of our population is living in urban areas, and if only 14% of agricultural land is arable, then how realistic is that really, you know? So that's basically the overview of what my thesis was, and what land reform is about in South Africa. So I'm just gonna go through some of the questions, and if anybody's got other questions, you can drop them there now. Okay, so Camille, your question with regards to urban land reform, the post-94 reform program placed heavy weight on the Land Claims Commission and the Land Claims Court. We've seen that the temporary nature of these structures have been a significant contributing factor to the failures of the reform program. Would capacitating these structures not be a good place to start? Yes, I definitely think so. I can't remember offhand what the source is, but I think I remember from one of my classes, like if we calculated at the current capacity that the land claims court has, it would take something like 300 years to basically process everyone's land claims. So obviously a big issue is it's not the sole reason that everything is the way it is, but it definitely is a good place to start. But so land claims is specifically not specifically restitution, but in terms of restitution claims, for me, like a big fault on the government side was that people were offered cash compensations for land as a means to basically settle that claim. And if you know anything about economics and like values of land, etc., like a cash claim compensation, it wasn't given at equivalent values of what that land could have meant. So that was also another fault in terms of the land claims court. Land should be given back for land taken, unless it's at market value. But my opinion is that most of them are not at market value. The question around the constitutional amendment has been very topical. Many constitutional experts as well as constitutional court judges have said that Section 25 provides for appropriation without compensation, rendering a need for an amendment an unnecessary exercise. Could you touch on this, especially considering that we may not always have a caring government? Okay, so I don't want to go too deeply into the discussion on the constitutional amendment. Let me just check your again. In my opinion, the proponents of pushing that forward, and a big part of the reasoning for pushing that forward, I've read a lot of submissions, and the NGOs that I worked at also gave many submissions. It depends on the framework that you're looking at it from. From a legal framework, yes, an amendment was not technically necessary. From a political framework, people would argue differently, that from a political framework, amending the constitution means that you're not going to have issues. There's going to be no barriers. It's going to be straight cut. It's going to be easier. It's a political message. It's a political message to people, in that sense. So I really think it depends on the framework that someone is coming from. Yes, technically, I agree. You don't need to, technically, from a legal interpretation side of things, you don't necessarily need to amend it in order to implement it. But in terms of process and how easily that would happen, obviously it would be much easier for it to happen with an amendment. Politically, it gives a different message. So that's I think the two sides of things. How do we factor in inflation? Are those prices quoted adjusted for inflation? So I assume that you were referring to those property prices from Mowbray. I mean, inflation, again, it works with the markets, and so yeah, I mean, you obviously have to factor in inflation, but like to give, I mean, trying to put it like in simple understandable terms here, but like what you're earning per month, your salary, like whether it goes up or down, like if you've got a property in Camps Bay and you work and you live and work in Goodwood, like your property in Camps Bay is way more, in Mowbray or Camps Bay is way more valuable than your property in Goodwood. So it's like you may be, or what is the case in many cases is that your earning level wouldn't allow you normally to purchase like that house in Mowbray or Camps Bay or whatever, but because you've accumulated it through generational wealth, you've got this whole other asset that's bringing you like this huge income. So yeah, I mean, I can't comment on the inflation between like 1963 and 1967, but I hope that kind of answers some of what you're wondering about. What does land reform mean for Indians and coloreds, with an ever-growing call for Black Africans to be prioritized? I think it means a lot of things. Honestly, it's not a straightforward, in my opinion, it's not a straightforward it's not a straightforward answer. Like as much as we in some breaths as Indians, coloreds and Black people are put under like a banner of non-white, we are not equal under that banner. The level of oppression, dispossession and disadvantage that Black people face, it's not the same as colored people. And the privilege that Indian people have in many senses is not at all what colored and Black people are privy to. So even though we often like to refer to all of us as a a blanket group, I think that we have to recognize that within that there are differences which make a huge difference to our livelihoods and to our lives. So I mean, we've had conversations. I'm sure people have been privy to conversations where oftentimes our older generation don't really understand the dynamics of things. But what's the point that I'm trying to make here? Black people were not afforded property rights, unlimited property rights, until 1994. Indian people were. Indian people came out of apartheid with houses that they were given or were allowed to purchase, which has given them, and colored people to a certain degree, which has given them a certain economic privilege, security of tenure privilege, which the black population wasn't afforded until 1994. And these are important things for us to remember. And I think that because collectively, again, this is where collectively we were all we were all under this oppressive system. So I think that we have to acknowledge that we all have a responsibility to still contribute towards undoing what is not being corrected. from then. So even though you're not living in a township, or you're not living like 10 people in a 1-bedroom house, we should still see ourselves as having a responsibility to contribute to undoing that whole system of injustice. And there's a reason that there's a growing call for Black Africans to be prioritized, which I'm not going to go further into now. I think I've mentioned enough of that. But I think in answering that question, that those are the things that we should recognize, acknowledge in relation to that. Not just offered, but strongly encouraged to take the monetary compensation. Yep, exactly. So on Yamin's point, like, it's really sad. Like, I mean, if you speak to people who were evicted from District 6, sent to live in Woodstock, and then because Woodstock has become now a well-located area and a highly sought-after area, the people have been evicted like from Woodstock, and it's just like the cycle that just keeps going around, and it's really just like, yeah. And then you meet people who, like, you know, we also like don't recognize that at the time of people being offered like compensation for things, it's like a lot of people were just really tired. You know, you've gone, like, you've lived your whole life under this oppressive system, and in a lot of senses the government just wanted to push like this process thing, and it's like, take this and go, take this and go. And a lot of people were just not, they didn't understand what was happening. You know, when you oppress someone economically, you take their land away from them, you oppress them economically, you make them live on 100 rand a day, and then you offer them 20,000 rand. It sounds a lot, but in the long run, yeah. What role do you think South African Muslims should be playing in land justice in South Africa? I think this is similar to the question on what Indian and colored people's roles are. I think that, like, we must look at how the Quran approaches social justice and start from there. You know, like, very clearly tells us to stand up for justice, whether it's against your parents or anyone else after that. And like, I think it's very easy when you live in the comfort of your privileged home not to realize how much injustice is going on just like around the corner from you. So I think that as South African Muslims, we have a responsibility to make ourselves aware of what's happening in our own country. And I really don't think a lot of people comprehend that, you know. It's like, you say something like more than 50% of our population is living below the poverty line. Like, it's a stat that goes in here and it comes out here. But like, to actually comprehend what that means, like, half of our half of our country, like, they don't have money to like feed themselves properly every day. Like, I don't think like we actually comprehend those kind of things. And so as Muslims, it's not about feeding schemes, man. It's not just about feeding schemes. It's about more than that. It's about creating the political will as a citizen yourself, like, for change. You know, I'm not discrediting feeding schemes and giving donations and those kinds of things, but it's about more than that. You know, we have a responsibility to do more than that. We have a responsibility to like recognize our fellow citizens, like, injustices being done upon them, and holding their hand and like holding hands together and saying like something needs to change. So yeah. That's what I think our role as South African Muslims should be. I also think that we, like in terms of career choices, um, we don't push enough people into political spaces. That's where we can afford like real change, and we have amazing people who have the skills and the willpower and the brains and everything to do those things. So yeah, I mean, I would encourage more people to to um, think about your career choices a bit differently, and think about why you choose to do something, and what difference are you going to make with it. Like, how are you going to fulfill your purpose of worshipping and doing good in your career. Like, it doesn't mean you have to have like a life change, but like any career, whatever job you're doing, you have some means of power, you have some means of influence, you have some resource that could possibly contribute to a bigger picture of like justice. um yeah, so I'll just wait a few more seconds in case there's any more questions. um Otherwise, yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope that it was insightful. Um, yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm ending now. Bye.